And welcome back to the Bellingham City Council committee meetings. Today is May 24th, 2021, and this afternoon our first committee meeting is Community and Economic Development, which is chaired by Councilmember Huffman. So I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you, Council President Stone. So today for the Community and Economic Development Committee, we have one item. I'm joined by Council members Lilliquist and Vargas, and we have a consideration of interim housing strategies, shelters. So staff from the City of Bellingham and County Human Services, with guidance from the county's Homeless Strategies Work Group, also known as HSW, completed a needs assessment that included an inventory of current shelter options operated throughout the county and available to people who are experiencing homelessness. Upon completion of the inventory of services and the identification of needs and gaps, a set of recommendations was created for the HSW's consideration. The HSW approved the recommendations at their April 16th meeting. The County Council accepted the recommendations at their May 4th meeting. Staff is seeking council acceptance of these strategies as its short and long-term strategy. And I believe I'll be turning this over to Tara Sundin to start the discussion.
Thank you. Tara Sundin, Community and Economic Development Manager for the city. I have Ann Deacon with me today. Ann is going to be providing you the bulk of the presentation. But before we get started, I wanted to make it clear that we are seeking a formal vote from council. That vote would be to accept the strategy, the actions within it. It isn't actually, though, voting on funding it. So I will talk more about that at the end of the presentation. But there are some unfunded projects in this plan. So keep that in mind. I know that was important to the county council. So Ann's going to walk us through that needs analysis, as well as all the recommendations, and I will join at the end of that presentation to provide some of the long-term strategy recommendations. Thank you, Ann, for being here today. And I'm also the one that's doing the tech work behind the scene here, and I hope it works out okay, because we have a few things to balance here. So Ann, should I start with the point in time count?
Let's start with the inventory first, if that's all right. So
Okay.
we can look at what we do have, and then we can look at our needs and gaps.
Great.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. So one of the things we do when we're completing a needs assessment and a strategic plan is to look, first of all, at what are the resources currently in place. And then obviously after that, what gaps and needs are we not meeting, and then what is the plan to meet those? And so we did a fairly comprehensive overview, and this is in your packet, of all the different kinds of shelters and interim housing throughout the county. And you'll notice that I won't go through each of these, but there are a number of specialized shelters that are listed here. We do know that there are some populations that simply need additional supports and cannot just participate successfully in a congregate setting that doesn't have special supports. So here we have also not only the location of each of these shelters, but how it's funded. And if you go to the last page here, it will show us about how many on a regular basis, and this is really night by night, these are always open, but if you can go down to the very bottom, you'll see just how many we have, around 450 for up to 516 beds. And the reason there's a range is because a number of these shelters provide services to families. And some families have 2 people and some families have 4 or 5 or more. So we can accommodate up to 516 people and do on a regular basis in various types of shelters. So that's where we started, was first of all, what do we have in our community? And then next, what don't we have? And so I think the point in time count data, and this is raw data, the report's coming out shortly, which is much more comprehensive. But when we looked at the point in time count, we found that, and we compared 2020 to 2021 in this document. First of all, we were told by Commerce that we didn't need to do the same extensive point in time count given the restrictions of COVID. However, our core teams stepped up and did more extensive count actually than the previous years, especially in Bellingham, less so in the county. And so here, if you look at the red, which is people who are unsheltered. So we just saw a list of all the different shelters available. Here are the people counted that were unsheltered. And you'll notice there's really no difference between 2020 and 2021. What is important to know is that during the count this last year, which is always the last week in January, there were 75 vacant shelter beds. So even though there were 218 people counted as unsheltered, and that would mean sleeping in tents or other areas that are not considered shelter of any kind. Tiny homes are considered shelter, although I can talk about that in a minute. We kind of skirted under the wire on being able to count those as shelter. But with this 218 that we counted, 75 could have used available shelter if they had chosen. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. So I think the point of this is really that there were less unsheltered people this year than last year, if we were to have those people using the available resources. And so
Excuse me, Ann.
Yes, Michael.
Was HomesNOW included in that inventory of available shelters?
Yes. And they were also counted as, anybody living there was counted as being sheltered. And so they would have been in that top line. All right. And so then we can look at the needs and gaps that we identified. And here we broke this down into categories so that we could get a sense of how do we create strategies for each of these different issues or areas of focus. And so one of the first things we noticed, and one of the biggest increases, and on that last document, and we don't need to go back to it, but you will have noticed a huge increase in the number of people being housed in emergency shelters in motels. A lot of that was due to families with children. We aren't exactly sure, and certainly weren't prepared for the mass exodus into homelessness for families with children. It was incredibly troubling to us. We were not expecting that many. And for us, that has risen to the very top in terms of making sure that we get families with children out of shelters and into more permanent living situations. So obviously, that is one of our top priorities, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but that was a big one. The other thing that we do know is that young adults, and by this, we're really talking about the 18 to 24-year-old age group, tend to be more vulnerable living unsheltered, simply because their age doesn't bring quite as much wisdom. Their brains are still forming, and they can be subject to victimization. So that was another concern for us, is to let us not forget that vulnerable population. And another vulnerable population that we have seen an increase over the last few years was elderly women in particular. 55 and older is what we call elderly, sadly, because some of us fall into that category. But this is a population that has been living unsheltered and obviously more vulnerable. And then medically fragile, and especially those with either cognitive decline like Alzheimer's, dementia, maybe developmental disabilities. These are also a concern for us. We do know that medical care at an inpatient level, for instance, in our hospital, may not be needed any longer, but the hospital is very concerned about exiting these people to homelessness because they don't, first of all, want their physical condition to deteriorate, but they also want to make sure that if there are things like PICC lines or something else that need continued care but may not need a hospital, that they need to make sure that there's some type of facility that can manage folks like that and keep them safe. And then special populations was another area. And these were really what we found in some of our homeless advocates helped us with this. And I should say that a lot of this information here is not just from the quantitative data that we collected, but the qualitative data as well. We did a lot of interviews of people, advocates, people who have experienced homelessness, to get a sense of what is it that we don't know? What do we need to know about the needs and gaps? This is one that was brought to us that hadn't initially come to us, but it was sad to hear that people who have special needs, especially maybe LGBTQ, but even people of color or people with noticeable physical disabilities tend to have a higher risk of harassment and maybe even harm. That was pretty distressing to hear. So we thought, all right, we need to make sure we're aware of that and also aware that maybe some of these people cannot also be in a larger congregate setting. And then with the help of the homeless outreach team, which is invaluable in terms of data collection, they are aware of about 80 to 90 small encampments throughout the county, especially in the Bellingham area. And so obviously one of the issues here for us when we're looking at small tent encampments is, do people have quick access to waste removal, toilet facilities? Some may not be interested in accepting any other form of shelter. So if that's the case, then, what do they need? Is government something that can provide that, or do we seek private organizations to do so? So those are some of the questions we were asking ourselves in this process. The reason I put tiny homes here is because as we were working with the Department of Commerce, we were trying to figure out if the HomesNOW tiny home villages would qualify as shelter. And this is I do not mean to disparage HomesNOW in any way, because I think they have really risen up in our community and are providing some helpful, supportive services. But what HUD and Commerce defines as shelter must include these following things: the ability to adjust the living structure to climate. So each unit would have to have heat or an opening window, maybe a fan. There would need to be a semi-permanent structure to prepare or eat food, not a tent, but, hard walls, ceiling. The living structure itself must have 4 walls, a ceiling, and a door that closes. They must have reasonable access to sanitation facilities with the ability to shower with hot and cold running water and toilets. Again, porta potties don't really qualify, and shower trailers don't really qualify. And then, of course, electricity to each living unit. We've certainly talked with HomesNOW about this. They certainly would love to be able to meet all of these qualifications. Right now, given the good work they have been doing, Commerce did allow us to count those 2 villages as shelters. But when government is looking at funding tiny homes, we are going to have to meet all of these criteria. And I know that Tara can talk more about that plan. The other thing in our qualitative data collection we found is that local governments may not be able to provide every type of shelter desired. In talking with some people, they simply didn't want what we had to offer. And what they had to offer is something that we couldn't provide. So, for instance, they wanted to continue engaging in behavior that they wanted to engage in that we would not be able to support. But the concern for us as a government or governments is really how do we still ensure a humane response to people living unsheltered who may not utilize any option available to them. So that was another thing we had to think about. And then, of course, the underutilization of available shelters. It was pretty distressing to see this last winter where at one point the Mission, which is a 200-bed facility now, had, it was up to capacity. It had people there every night full. And then, as you recall, of course, there was a protest and a lot of people left the base camp and set up tents. And then from that point on, some people never returned, even though we had the ability to provide quarantine for some of them if they had been exposed to COVID, which there was an outbreak at the camp. We did have the ability to offer quarantine, a motel unit of their own, so that they could then get back to the camp. But what we found, sadly, is that some people were spreading misinformation about base camp and discouraged the use of it for a number of people. That was pretty distressing to us because we had some case managers working with people who had moved to the camp who were very vulnerable. They had been doing very well, were stable at base camp, moved to this protest encampment, and actually suffered assault and some pretty horrible trauma. So we had a number of case managers traumatized, not to mention some vulnerable people. So that was a very distressing time. This next one, we know this is a problem, but I bring it up because this is one of our very greatest challenges. Methamphetamine use has increased significantly. And the reason it poses a unique challenge is because people under the influence of methamphetamines can become aggressive, volatile, and when they're using meth, they can actually contaminate the living unit they're in or the shelters they're in. And obviously, I work for a health department, but it's pretty difficult knowing that somebody may be damaging a living unit, especially if we put somebody into permanent supportive housing, knowing that when they leave, the next person coming in may be exposed to some toxic environments. So this has been probably our greatest challenge. It is not unique to Whatcom County or Bellingham. And when we talk with the homeless outreach team, what they tell us is that the biggest difference over the last 10 to 15 years is the significant increase in drug use. And with that, a number of people who are living unsheltered right now talk about really a lack of hope. Pretty depressing for us. So this is something we are working with peers, not only across the state, but throughout the nation about what kind of response can we offer that will be helpful here. The last two, the shelter availability in neighboring counties. Skagit County does not have a night-by-night quick access shelter like our base camp, for instance. They have increased access to motel stays and certainly are trying to put some more tiny homes in Burlington, for instance. But we do know that Skagit residents are referred to Whatcom resources at times. We also have had reports where law enforcement with the Skagit wording on the side of their car actually drive people all the way up to Whatcom in the middle of the cold winter months just to make sure they can drop somebody off to a shelter. So one of the things we know is that as a local community, a great local community, we are not able to solve regional problems or state problems with just our local resources. So we know it's important for residents to be sheltered in the counties they live in. And our hope, of course, is that elected officials can work closely with our county neighbors to increase shelter capacity. And then finally, we talked about this, but the point in time count showed how many folks were unsheltered, and sadly that we did have vacancies. And in fact, in 2021, we had 170 more spots available, shelter spots available, than we did in 2020. So after we did all this data collection, assessment, identified the needs, then we put together a set of recommendations for us to start working on. And these are not things that just will be accomplished overnight, but these are what we had the Homeless Strategies Work Group look at and approve as their recommendations to County Council. And the resolution that established the Homeless Strategies Work Group that County Council resolved was to be a temporary committee to look at strategies to serve people who are living homeless and to make recommendations to County Council. They were also asked to perform their work expeditiously. Of course, COVID slowed that way down, but this is their product and their set of recommendations to County Council. And you'll notice at the top, there were some overarching goals, which were obviously clarify the extent of local government support. So knowing that governments alone aren't going to be the answer, and that some things, like I said earlier, that government can't provide must be provided by others. That if we can't serve everyone, we need to prioritize the most vulnerable populations and ensure that we have their safety in mind. And that we needed to build upon current resources wherever possible. And obviously, just to make sure our investments go as broadly and as far as possible. And then to invest in long-term permanent solutions over temporary crisis solutions when resources are inadequate to do both. So again, it's always a balance. What we also know is that in our housing continuum, that we really need to balance how much we provide for shelters versus maybe permanent supportive housing, case management, long-term housing as well. So we can't overinvest in any one category and then get people stuck. So if we put all our eggs in the basket of shelters, people would never get out of shelters, for instance, because we couldn't move them through the system and get them housed. And for us, of course, the solution to homelessness is housing. So here are the recommendations. Any questions before I get into the recommendations? All right.
I see no hand.
So we divided these into short-term and long-term. So short-term, the first thing we've always been told, certainly by County Council, is they don't want to see any families living in cars, no matter what. So for us, this again was a stopgap measure, but let's make sure we can set aside a certain amount of money to serve families with children who are currently homeless in motels while we're hopefully beefing up housing case management support and getting people into permanent housing. And then as we did this last year, again, during the winter months, establish the overflow shelter so that if base camp becomes full, we still have a place for people. But we are recommending for this next winter to expand the time frame. So it would start in November rather than December, and it would go through March rather than February, just because the weather, as you know, is unpredictable. And again, this would allow for 30 more spots. And then although we had so many vacancies in shelters last year, we never set up severe weather shelters, in part because of that, and in part because the volunteers who operated these the year before were elderly and obviously not yet vaccinated at that point. And so finding volunteers to step up to operate severe weather shelters was very difficult. But we do believe that, and we noticed in past years, is there are some people who will not use any shelter ever, except when the weather becomes very severe. And that's when we actually saw people for the first time accessing those shelters, the severe weather shelters. They were willing to use those shelters when the weather was really severe. So we want to continue that. And then we do have a data collection process, but we thought we would formalize it and make sure that we have some regular questions that we ask and then answer to make sure that we understand to the greatest extent possible, why are people unsheltered? What is it they need? How do we consider the most vulnerable populations in being able to respond quickly? And as I had said before, here are some of the identified vulnerable populations listed here. And that we know that the homeless outreach team is ideal for this work in that they visit most all the small encampments. And so we are working with them to formalize qualitative data collection so that we have a much better sense of what truly are the needs of these people, especially the most vulnerable. This next one, supporting continuation of current specialty shelters, as we talked about before, there are people that simply cannot function successfully in a shelter that isn't unique to their needs. So for instance, we have shelters specifically for people with very serious mental illness who experience delusions, hallucinations, psychosis. Obviously, we have domestic violence shelters. We have a number of other shelters where people have special needs and we need to continue to support those. And then the next one is support continuation of tiny home villages. So certainly HomesNOW, if there's a way we can help them meet the needs of their folks in a way that takes away any question about whether or not they need shelter, that would be helpful. And also, as you've already heard, and I'll let Tara talk more about this, but the pending village coming that will be with Road to Home and Lehigh will be really important here. And then, of course, to encourage local elected officials to work with Skagit in island counties to increase shelter capacity. I will leave that to you and how that's done, but for us, we really want to make sure that we can take care of our own and know that even then our resources are limited. So as we go further down, there's some long-term goals as well. The one thing we did want to say is I know there was a big push for tiny homes, get more tiny homes. We also know that trends have changed. So when the Homeless Strategies Work Group was first set by resolution by County Council, the first goal was to establish a 200-bed low-barrier shelter. Well, that was accomplished. And then we heard, well, now not everybody wants to use that kind of shelter. Let's do tiny homes. And then there was a big push for tiny homes. And now there's talk about maybe we buy a motel or a hotel and put everybody in there as a shelter, which of course, again, for us is challenging because we still need people to run and operate those facilities. And so we have recommended against the purchase of any more tiny homes other than the tiny home village that is in process with the city of Bellingham until we've done our work and to make sure that we've really not only solidified to the extent possible really what the needs are of people who are homeless currently, and how do we give them a shelter if a shelter is needed that would provide the plumbing needed, a better place to cook meals, heat, etc. And how do we, and who is it that we intend to serve? So for us, we felt like it was irresponsible to just throw out more tiny homes, as some folks have said who are homeless advocates. They're just wooden tents, and perhaps we shouldn't just be providing wooden tents, that perhaps we need to be a bit more thoughtful and comprehensive in the types of shelters we offer, even for people who may need something other than a large congregate shelter. So those are our short-term recommendations, and hopefully moving on all of those for next winter. And then we also have some long-term, which we're looking more like 2 to 4 years, and I'll let Tara take over from here.
Thanks, Anne. So yeah, I would consider as a planner, 2 to 4 years isn't exactly long-term, but when we are talking about shelter strategy, that's why we're using that term, because we won't be able to bring these online necessarily by next winter. But I'm going to start at the bottom and go work my way up. So obviously base camp, we're coming up on 1 year at our temporary location. So we have just a little over 3 years left on our lease. And so this is definitely a priority of the city and the counties. This particular move, the Lighthouse Mission is actually having a neighborhood meeting this Wednesday night about their project in Old Town. So the goal for the mission is to move base camp from Cornwall down to a current property that they own at the corner of F and Holly. The city's partnership here will look a little bit more like we're probably going to help them with some investments in infrastructure. So that's something in the probably over the next year or so you'll see come before you, maybe a little bit longer, is an investment to support the development, but not actually in its operations. The mission is not looking long-term for the city or the county to help them operate. That's something that they want to do with private dollars. The next project up, establish a shelter and services for people who are medically fragile. This project, referred to as Way Station, I know some of you are probably more familiar with it than others, has been a project in the works for a couple of years. It is a project that's being sponsored by Unity Care and Peace Health, a really great partnership. They're working closely with Whatcom County. The goal here, the plan, is to develop the way station at the current health department offices on State Street. And they have just received funding for about half of the cost of the capital portion of this facility. So that's really great news. I know that they're also working with the federal government to bring in some additional resources and some private fundraising. So far, this project is probably looking like more of a partnership with Whatcom County than the city. And they think that they probably can pull this one together without the city's investment. But that's, still a little bit early. I wanted to mention that this is a respite facility. So for people that do not have a home, probably not appropriate to go back to base camp, need a little bit more medical care, but not to the degree that a hospital provides, right? And then also the hygiene services that we've gotten with the new base camp, our response for hygiene has just been improved greatly with showers and access to laundry, but this facility will also provide that along with some medical services, maybe eye care, foot care. So this is pretty exciting. This is something that they want to, I think, get underway construction-wise in the next few months to a year. So that's great. And then the one at the top is focused on families with children. And we have talked to you about this particular demographic quite a bit this year. And, Anne was talking about how we need to make sure we are continuing our investments in the permanent solutions and not just crisis. And I think what we're seeing with families and children right now, we are investing in those permanent solutions, but we're recognizing that we need more investment. And so the city council actually has invested more in this particular demographic, but in order to serve more families, We need to make sure that we have the housing and the case management support to go with it, the vouchers, so that we can kind of get that pipeline flowing. And what we've come to realize is that we think that, unfortunately, nobody ever wanted to have a motel be the solution for families with children. But we do know that a motel is better than a motel stay is certainly better than sleeping in a vehicle. So it's better, but it isn't ideal for families that need to be working with case managers for, a while. And what's happened is our families are staying in these motels longer than they should be. That means we've got kids sharing a really small space with parents. There's no separation of room, and it's just not the best physical layout for a trauma-informed care or kind of recovery back to housing. And so what we've done here, what we're doing with this project is we're looking at the feasibility right now. So been working with the Opportunity Council, Whatcom County, and Lydia Place to look at kind of some possibilities. And what we've done is we've written a letter to the Mount Baker Foundation. And I just heard on Friday that they have decided to fund the scoping and feasibility analysis for this project. So this is how early this project is. We would partner, the city staff would serve as kind of project coordinator during this phase. And really we're looking at what, if we were to build something in Bellingham, what would that look like? We need to look at best practices. We need to look at size. It's kind of scoping this, what services should come along with this facility. And then look at, of course, at the feasibility of not just operations, but the financial feasibility. So this work will take place over the next probably 4 to 6 months. And a lot more information on this one. I want to mention that, some of these actions are funded by the city, some of these actions are funded by the county, and some of these aren't currently funded. So I wanted to mention some things that are not quite yet funded that you will likely see Samia and I come back and talk to you about in either the coming months or longer term, like with the case of families with children. I don't know that Anne touched on it in much detail, but Northwest Youth Services is looking at a young adult shelter. Again, that's that 18 to 24-year-old age group. And they have received some funds from the state just recently, so that might advance that project more quickly. And I know that they will be looking for a potential partnership with the city and county, and that will be part of that feasibility. So that is one. The severe weather shelters that Anne mentioned, we need to see what the faith-based community needs from local government in order to be successful and be able to step forward. We know Christ the King is able to do that this coming year without our help. We know others aren't able to do the work again this coming winter, but we want to make sure that maybe money is not an obstacle for them partnering with the city and the county on that. Of course, the project with families with children. And then I mentioned Base Camp will be looking at some infrastructure dollars. So again, today we're not asking for a budget authority, but we do at this point in May, we want to make sure that this is a good strategy moving forward so that when we get into the middle of winter, that's not when we're coming up with new projects. That's a very it doesn't work to design projects in the middle of that season. So Anne and I are available to answer questions about this approach. Again, the county council has they voted to accept these recommendations, and they have a housing advisory committee that will be overseeing and making recommendations to the county council on funding. Is that right, Anne? Does that capture that correctly?
And just to provide oversight that the strategies are moving forward, some accountability to the plan. And the Housing Advisory Committee does have, it was set by interlocal among the county and all 7 cities, and it does have representation from the small cities as well as the city of Bellingham and the county, as well as homeless advocates and housing developers.
Okay, that was an incredibly informative presentation. Thank you so much. Councilmember Lillquist.
Thank you. I unfortunately have a list of 6 important topics I'd like to touch upon. Let me just take one and cede the floor. I think there is a mistake in the recommendations. I recall that for the data collection one, there was a motion made, I made it, that was accepted, that added to the data collection recommendation. The current recommendation says to focus data collection on night-by-night shelters to determine utilization needs. And the amendment basically pointed out that looking not at those who are using shelters, but looking at those who are not using shelters is an equally significant data to gather. Was that modified recommendation passed on to the county council?
Yes, that is the point of that. At this point, our work with the homeless outreach team in particular, because they're the ones who can get out there to those who are in encampments.
Great, thank you.
Any other committee members for Councilmember Vargas?
I don't have any questions per se. This is amazing work to drill down with what's really going on in our community and what our needs are. And so I'm going to move to approve that we accept these interim housing strategies for those experiencing homelessness.
On the table. I'll go with one question before we let Councilmember Lillquist get to his list. Let's see here. The identified shelter needs and gaps, which is so helpful to see, what we need based on qualitative and quantitative data. So it's hard to find solutions without that. So thank you for compiling this. Going forward, how will we prioritize this list of needs in finding solutions? And because, of course, also that this list needs list is going to be fluid, and we'll see changes with different circumstances in our community. So just who will be overseeing this priority list, and how will we decide where to focus our solutions?
So some of the ways we prioritize is, it's almost like backing into it, but sometimes we have resources or opportunities available, and so we jump on those. We're also working on all of them right now to some degree. And I think one of the most important things to us right now is to find out 2 things. Why was there such an increase in families exiting to homelessness? We know part of it is COVID, but why else? And then secondly, why are people not using the shelters that we have available? So those 2 things are really research oriented, but we're working on both of those right now, because before we start building more shelters, obviously we need to know what kind is going to be needed. We don't want to build something that no one uses.
And Holly, I would say I foresee us taking a look at this annually with the county and the Housing Advisory Committee that they have around this time of the year, so that, or, starting a little bit earlier after the winter season, so that we have time to prepare for the next season. But as far as priorities go, when you look to those long range, I say long range, but I think that's Anne's terminology as a service provider. Those projects are big lifts if you think about it for our community our size. We're taking on 3 really large projects as a community, and maybe a 4th if there's a young adult shelter. So a shelter with families with children, that's one of the priorities that we're saying that we need to look at. The waste station, making sure we have adequate place for people that are medically fragile is a high priority. So that's why that's on the list. And base camp, right now, we don't have a permanent solution for base camp. And it doesn't serve everybody, but it sure serves a lot of people. So I would say those are the priorities that we're presenting right now, all not completely funded in our community, not even close. So I say that is what our priorities should stay focused on. And then definitely that severe weather shelter component, if we can find some partner agencies to help us there.
Councilmember Lillquist. You're muted.
You're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've reorganized my thoughts and I only have 4 points I'd like to touch on rather than 6, so that's good news. I'm going to vote in favor of the recommendations, but I want to register my concern with at least 2 of them. One of them is to follow the agreed upon guidelines for severe weather shelters, which includes a criteria of 28 degrees as an absolute trigger, with some room for triggering severe weather shelters at warmer temperatures. That criteria has always concerned me. And I know the reason why that stringent criteria was adopted is if you adopt a more lax criteria, you really turn them into winter shelters rather than severe weather shelters. So I'm still concerned about that one particular guideline. And I'm also concerned about the recommendation to have no further investments in tiny homes. I think tiny homes are proving themselves. And in particular, I'm impressed with the fact that tiny homes, even without the level of service that I would like to see, they give something that is powerful. They give a sense in having your own space, gives you privacy, autonomy, consistency, a sense of safety, a sense of place, a sense of belonging. That is powerful in a shelter like a tiny home that is never found in a drop-in type center. So I'm not entirely comfortable with kind of putting a pause on tiny homes. I'm still interested in them continuing to play a role. So I will be voting for the recommendations, but I have caveats on those 2 elements.
Councilmember Stone.
Thank you, Councilmember Huffman. Everyone's pictures were rearranging on my screen, so sorry. So I had a bunch of things on my list, and now I first, I guess, want to respond to what Councilmember Lillquist just said. Because I struggle with this point, but I think I have to push back on what Councilmember Lillquist said. I agree that these are the things that tiny home villages offer. This is what we've seen, is that there is this sense of community that's created and safety, which is obviously positive and something that we want to see. But my concern is that still seeing shelter as transitional housing, that this is not where we want someone to land permanently. And my concern has been that the tiny home villages, this is my personal perspective, is offering sort of a more formalized encampment type setting, almost like a tent encampment. It's a little more formalized, but it's not supporting necessarily that transition. And so people are staying more stagnant because they've found a place where they do feel safe and comfortable, and they've developed a sense of community. And so there's a place for that, but my concern is that it doesn't further our efforts to sort of, try to end homelessness and transition people into permanent housing. And so I'm not certain how we deal with that. But my question then, and then I see lots of hands, so I'll hand it over, was regarding, so we saw a presentation this morning, or Captain Frank with the community paramedic program presented and was talking about lack of beds or space sometimes when they go out to a call and where to place somebody. And so obviously that's addressing some of those gaps. But what you're mentioning about shelter beds in other counties and throughout the region, and obviously we're bearing the burdens somewhat of the lack of those in other areas. But I was wondering about the mental health beds at the hospital, because that's something that he'd mentioned, was that people are then brought maybe to St. Joe's because they can't find a bed elsewhere. And then obviously upon release, or when they are discharged from the hospital, they're here and we pick them up and provide services upon leaving the hospital. And so I'm just wondering if those types of beds included in these counts, like mental health beds at the hospital? And then also, how do we look at those specialty shelters? Because I really feel like the mental health and substance use issues, really that's more about treatment, right, versus shelter. And so some of these really high needs that we talk about and saying, do we develop a shelter for these individuals, when I don't know that we're going to be able to create a shelter that meets those needs, that really it's about treatment and services. And so does that conversation need to be right in another space? But obviously it interconnects here. So I apologize for the rambling, but thank you for the time.
It's more of an Ann Deacon, would you like to respond to that?
Sure, I'll respond to both issues. So we do have specialty shelters focused on people with serious mental illness. Probably not enough, but we do have some, and they are great partners in getting people moved into permanent housing. And those shelters are not drop-in, but they're actually by referral. They're still shelters, short-term, but they do work wonderfully. So the issue for us is the staffing, right? Do we have a workforce that can provide that? But if people are in crisis, certainly the Crisis Stabilization Center that is now open can help with that. But it still needs to have a crisis component, not just because they're lacking shelter at the moment. And then in terms of the tiny homes, I just want to say that our goal right now is to make sure that our investments in the future are going to be the ones most appropriate to the needs. And we know that tiny homes is a trend right now, but like I said, before that, the 200-bed shelter was the trend. And I didn't want us getting stuck into what everybody wants today, but to really look at what is going to be the best return on our investment, what is really going to meet the needs of our community. And to do that, we need to be much more immersed in the information of what people need. And so that was why the hold on tiny homes. I didn't want us to invest in something that was going to then sit idle because it wasn't the favored choice.
And another comment on the tiny homes with the Garden View project, or our partnership with Road to Home in Lehigh. The city staff made that recommendation to go, through that RFQ process because we wanted to hire an agency that could have those wraparound services. So that village is kind of, I think, addresses both Michael and Hannah's points, is we don't want those villages to be an ending place or a holding pattern for years. We want people to get the services that they need and get as quickly into housing as possible. We know that with the supply of housing, it's a little bit more of a lag time than what I'm hoping it will be in a couple of years from now. But that does comes with a pretty significant partnership with the city to provide the funds to operate that village.
Okay, we're running a little bit over time, but there are at least two more questions. I think Councilmember Vargas was first.
Thank you. So going off of something we just started in the discussion is the people not using shelter, and looking into the data why people aren't using shelter. I mean, one of the hardest things for me this year in managing public conversation is an average of 75 beds that weren't being used this year, whereas the public being very adamant that we're not helping people and not offering services and there's no availability when when actually there's an average of 75 beds available most of last winter, which was very, very disturbing that those weren't being used, considering the time and effort put into base camp and other resources so that we could help people. And so I know this isn't a conversation we're going to solve right now, but I would like to have a conversation, a broader conversation, even with the county, about why people aren't using shelter, and to bring this more to the forefront. Also, just to so that the public can understand that it's not just we put something out there and it all gets used, that there's a little bit of a disconnect there, and how do we move people through that? So I know that this is a much bigger conversation, but one I would like to have in the future about how, why people aren't using the shelter. I know some of the basic things that people say, but a deeper dive maybe into that and with a public discussion so it becomes, builds more awareness. Thanks.
Okay, I think Councilmember Anderson was next.
Thank you very much. I'm actually going to save my questions because I'm really hoping, as Councilmember Vargas had said, is that I think we do need to have an expanded conversation again, hopefully sooner than later. I do want to say I so appreciate this plan, and I do agree with much of the objectives and what's been highlighted. And I think we have done some extraordinary work in the community, and you know, much to some members feeling like we're not doing anything. When you really look at all of our partnerships and beds and what we're moving towards, I think, you know, there's always room for improvement. We have much higher need than what we can meet, but I think given a community of our size and the fact that for multiple counties, we kind of are the place. Because we do have the low barrier shelter. What I would like coming forward, hopefully if we could have another meeting where we're not so hampered by time, I have concerns about the other counties that don't have the low barrier shelter and the fact that people do come to Bellingham. I hear from community members who are very concerned, very generous, very supportive, but they have kind of a mental concern that if we build it, they will come. And so how do we ever get ahead of it when our people to the south are not doing their fair share? And the concern that we will become a regional area for support services because of our care and generosity to the community. And it's just not Skagit and Island. I believe even Snohomish, the Everett area, last I was informed, they don't have the low barrier shelter. And so people do come as far as even Seattle if there's not enough services there and they feel like we have it. We have people brought to us. So, I mean, I just don't see how we get ahead. And I know that's a larger conversation with the state and other entities, but and I don't know if we could address that, but that's one area that I would like to dive more into is how do we address this to ensure that other municipalities and counties do their work too. But the other thing that I really want to spend some time in the future talking about is not just the Plan A that we're working with the low barrier shelter for winter, but we saw this winter with the snowstorm coming and with COVID, our library being closed, we didn't have a place for people who are houseless to be able to just go during the day and warm up, who did not want to go to base camp. The reality was there were members in the community who just weren't going to go there. And having a very impassioned conversation with our mayor, who was very understanding and supportive, we really kind of on a short notice opened up an overnight and day temporary shelter due to the inclement weather, the snowstorm coming. And unfortunately, we had to close it a little bit earlier, but we were trying to get volunteers. We were having city staff. And I felt like that just wasn't something we should have been doing on the fly. I would like not only the plan A and then the plan B, but what's the plan C, that if the churches aren't volunteering, the senior center, the seniors who are so generous with their time to help staff an emergency warming shelter, if they're not able to do it, what is our plan? And I would love to see it in writing. These are the triggers, and that if all else fails, what county employees, what city employees are going to go to such location that we know we're going to have the cots there, the blankets, the warm meals, and we're going to be ready to go, so that, you know, worst case scenario, we see that snowstorm coming, we know, and we have confidence, and our community has confidence that this is how it's going to work. And that we know for sure that even if we don't have the volunteers, then we're going to have the paid staff in order to be there on site. I don't want another winter where I'm having a conversation with Mayor Fleetwood begging that we do something. That should not happen again. And that's been probably one of my biggest points of frustration watching council, and probably for the last 5 years. Just like, what are we going to do? Looking at the weather, it's going to snow. What's the plan? And being on the inside now, I still didn't even have those answers to give community members. So that would be my wish, is that we get that worked out before the end of summer so that we know we're ready.
So I got the okay from Council President Stone to go till 2:15 on this one. This is a really good discussion.
Can I just make one comment though?
Yeah.
This is not my impassioned voice is not condemnation of your work, and at all. You have probably the toughest job in our community, and you've taken, in my opinion, a lot of abuse from people, and that is not at all my intention whatsoever. I have a lot of admiration for your hard work, and I mean, everybody who's working on this are just amazing for their commitment and their skill. And in some ways, it's like, my other part of the question is, what do you need from us so that we can make it work for you? So that these things can be filled, because it shouldn't rest just on your shoulders. It's on all of ours. So whatever you need, at least whatever I can provide, I'm more than happy to advocate for that, so that we can make sure that we're ready. So I don't want the public feeling that it's a failure at all, because there's been tremendous, wonderful work happening. It's just one component of many. So I'm hoping we can put some focus on it. Thank you.
I appreciate that, and wish I would have brought my wish list. But I will say, in response to a couple of things that were said here, I want to remind people that the base camp was fully utilized, was at capacity until the protest. And then there was a purposeful effort to discourage people from using it. And that was based in some misinformation and vitriol. That isn't everything. I just want us to understand that, you know, there was some backward movement based on misinformation. And so I think a public discussion is important, but I also think in terms of what I would love from elected officials is the ability to promulgate correct information, to honor those who are doing good work, and to make sure that that information is widespread. And I know that we are getting ready to work with the city on a communications effort to help counteract some of the misinformation that's been out there. But that is one thing I would ask is, how do we help change the tone so that everybody is on the side of solutions as opposed to undermining current solutions in place?
Tara?
Just wanted to respond to Lisa's recommendation. So this is why we're bringing this proposal to the city council and the county council, is because staff needs to understand what the expectations are as we move forward, so that we are not in wintertime coming up with solutions. So that is the point of this work. I have not talked to the mayor about the proposal that you are putting forth there, but that solution is not on the list. The solution to have a city staffed operated shelter is not on the list of proposed in our proposal at this time. So that would require the majority of the council taking an action to change that. That would not necessarily mean that the county council accepted that, but that's the kind of direction we need. I just want to say that so that I don't leave that unspoken, and there's a mismatch of what your expectation is with what I think our work program is.
So I have one question somewhat related to some of the things that Councilmember Anderson had mentioned, and then I'll pass it to Councilmember Lillquist. So a little bit of a different subject, but the recommendation to speak with some of our neighboring counties about action that they could take to help be a partner in solutions, and then the data collection aspect of our goals as well. Will we be collecting data that could potentially help us in those discussions with neighboring counties? Do we collect data on who is being served and where they're coming from? And would that data potentially help in those discussions when we're talking about needs?
I think we can certainly add that to it. If that is information that you would like, we can gather that to the extent possible.
That seems like it'd be very helpful. Yeah. Councilmember Lillquist.
Thank you. And thank you, by the way, for allowing this conversation to be extended. I'd like to offer a few more comments, hopefully truncated, and end with my own request for additional discussion. The way station is fantastic, but it's really a respite. It's not interim housing. I think we have a need for interim housing for populations which are medically fragile, elderly, disabled, and similarly, I think we have a deficit in housing resources for families with children we've talked about. And in both those cases, I'd like us to consider purpose-built facilities. A purpose-built facility, which is suitable interim housing for people who have higher physical needs. A purpose-built family housing structure, which is appropriate for families, trauma-informed, feels like housing rather than like a motel. I'm talking about capital projects. So I'm going to pivot. What I request for the further discussion soon, whenever we're ready, is to start talking and hearing from staff about what both the city and the county think we might do with the House Bill 1590 monies. Combining our two jurisdictions, that's $5 million. I think with that money, we can start planning for behavioral health supports for permanent supportive housing, and maybe we can start talking about purpose-built facilities to deal with the two populations I mentioned. I think those are two great ideas. Maybe they're better ideas, maybe not. So my request is that we come back and we start talking about what we can start funding in both the unfunded elements that were mentioned and in maybe some purpose-built housings for the two populations that I mentioned. So that's my request for further discussion. Thank you. Oh, one final thing. Sorry. Hannah, I actually think we agree on the tiny home issue. I mean, truly, I believe what the National Alliance in Homelessness says was that even shelter needs to be a stepping stone to housing. So I agree. We do not want to just warehouse people in shelters. No matter how nice the shelter is, that can't be our final goal. So I actually think, frankly, I think we're in 100% agreement if we just look a little closer.
Any further? Councilmember Stone.
Thank you. So just briefly, I wanted to follow up what Ann Deacon was saying about the misinformation. And when I speak to neighborhood associations and other groups in the community and they ask, what are action items to give us? I always say, my action item for you is to practice due diligence, take some steps back, some deep breaths, and make sure that you are getting firsthand information from reliable sources before you, continue to share that information. And even this past weekend, as a part of the community visioning for the Racial Equity Commission, we're broken up into small groups, and in one of the groups that I was placed in, someone who very well-intentioned community member who's out there doing, great volunteer work and trying to help bring people clothing and food, and but spoke to that and said that, but people don't want to go to base camp because you're forced to pray in order to stay the night, and you can't bring your belongings. And I was, shaking my head, and the facilitator called on me to respond. And it's, so it's not all, I know that there are sometimes people have ulterior motives and their own agenda. But my concern, even beyond that, is well-intentioned individuals who are really trying to make a difference and to do good in the community, but have misinformation that, and as I've said before, we're all guilty of it, but just to do that due diligence. And so I appreciate your call on elected officials to do our part, because we are in circles where we hear that information, and just to push back and recognize the good work that's being done. And especially there at base camp, just because it was such, when Councilmember Lillquist talks about purposeful, projects, that facility was brought to fruition very intentionally, with lots of thought and planning to ensure that that was a safe space for community members, with additional services and support resources. So thank you for that. And thank you, Councilmember Huffman.
That was an excellent point to end on. So there is a motion on the table, and that was a long time ago. So this would be a motion to approve the interim housing strategies. All in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? So I will bring that recommendation to the full council tonight. Thank you so much, Ms. Sundin and Deacon, for all of that information. This was incredibly informative. So I hope lots of people see it. Speaking of finding information from trusted sources. Okay, and with that, end of committee.